Hello and good evening. I'm very happy to welcome Toma Pilein tonight for our last Subnet talk of the year. He comes from the FH Hagenberg, and he will be talking about the invisible life of radio signals and electronics signals. So please take it away.
Thank you very much, Rüdiger. Thank you for inviting me. A warm welcome also from my side. So my name is Toma Pilein, also known by my legal name, Thomas Prendl. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm an artist, a researcher in the field of electronic textiles. I'm also a curator and also a teacher. I have many roles, and last time my colleague Sarah Mlaka was here presenting a concept on which we worked on called audio interaction concepts, but today I will talk about something completely different. So I will talk about a topic that I'm not a particular expert, but it has become a very important part of my artistic work also, and a big interest of mine. And I will tell you how I first come in close contact with it. I'll give you a short glimpse into the many areas that it covers. And afterwards, I'll also be very interested in what you think about the topic and how you relate to it. And the topic is radio in art and science. And the talk is called 3 Hertz to 3 terahertz. And the title should also reflect the jargon-heavy obscurity in which information on radio is often shrouded. It might be not so common practice here in Austria, but it is definitely in the United States, placing human skeletons in front of family homes in October. Skeletons as symbols are most often a sinister reminder of the inevitability of death. Yet during Halloween, the skeletons almost become a symbol of comfort, a sign of a happy family who have the time and the resources to decorate their home with human remains made out of plastic. So in 2021, Halloween was approaching, and motivated by my interest in this peculiar tradition, I wanted to build an animatronic skeleton from an anatomical classroom skeleton. So I wanted it had to have glowing red eyes, and it should be able to move its head, and also should be able to move its arm. And in one arm, it would hold, most essentially, a mobile phone. The skeleton would patiently wait in front of the house I live in for an unsuspecting passenger to come by. In the night, when you are passing by, the skeleton would turn its head towards you, lift its arm, and your phone would ring. So the skeleton is giving you a call, and you probably better not pick up. It's probably a scam call. But yeah, basically I was intrigued by the idea of invoking fear through technology in a playful context. So I see it as a means to reveal certain properties of technology through fear. And the calling skeleton demonstrates which intimate place we give mobile phones in our lives. So knowing someone's telephone number can be more intimate than knowing someone's name, for example. Also, there's little awareness of the privacy issues that come with just carrying an active mobile device with you. People are constantly tracked in public spaces through their mobile phone footprint, most prominently by retail stores, but also by government agencies or malicious entities, like skeletons. In that context, the skeleton is a wonderful equalizer, as it is a sexless and classless former human being without any specified ethnicity. So it could basically be anyone who is tracking you here. But the essential question probably here is, how could the skeleton know your number? So at that time, I had no particular concept of how mobile communication systems work. I naively imagined that mobile phones would just identify themselves through radio signals and just sending out their modulated telephone number. And the skeleton would just need to listen in on the radio waves and demodulate them, and then it would have your number and it could call you. But as you could imagine, it's not that simple. So every device participating in a cellular network has an international mobile subscriber identity, short IMSI. And it's a kind of an internationally unique 15-digit number. And to prevent eavesdroppers from identifying and tracking the subscriber, it is sent as rarely as possible. Also, only the network operators know which IMSI numbers other participants have and which mobile number is connected to it. So they never send the actual mobile telephone number in kind of raw signal, but encrypt them. In the newer cellular network standards 4G and 5G, the communication also use encryption more extensively and make it even harder to track or spoof users. So are we safe of nosy skeletons? And the question is, the answer is no, because there are relatively accessible ways to eavesdrop on your mobile number or even intercept calls you make without you noticing. And this can be done by downgrading your connection to a more insecure standard by just jamming your signal. And this was also demonstrated by Palama et al., who show in their paper IMSI Catchers in the Wild, a real-world 4G, 5G assessment. And they show basically how you can do that. And the IMSI catcher is a device that imitates a cellular tower. So it lets unknowing mobile devices connect to the fake tower and forwards the calls to a legit tower. And doing this, it's able to eavesdrop on any call that the connected mobile devices can make. And as you can imagine, this is highly illegal, just as intercepting a telephone number, which is also illegal, which is, to my knowledge, fined by 30,000 euros in Austria. But would someone actually notice if the skeleton would do that? And yes, there is this agency, the Fernmeldebüro Oberösterreich und Salzburg, that nicely connects our two federal states. It's located in Linz. And it monitors the electromagnetic spectrum for violations of the telecommunications law. You could call them basically radio police. I really like this building, for it looks somewhat like a spaceship from the 60s or so.
Spaceships were only built in the 60s, looks like. Spaceships were only built in the 60s.
Yeah, true. Maybe. Yeah, so in front of this building, I basically stopped following the skeleton and went another way. But the skeleton was very important because it was my receptionist to the rabbit hole of radio, art, and science. Starting from here, I discovered the peculiar field of amateur radio, where people, among many other things, use the moon as a reflector for communicating with people on the other side of the planet. It's fine. I read about radio astronomy with tin-foiled umbrellas. I was educated about radio wave propagation on Earth and how it's dependent on the 11-year cycle of the sun. I found out about Aries research, which I mostly ignored before, and which complexity and influence and so many other fields I was absolutely not aware of. Still, most of it remains somewhat obscure and inaccessible to many people. And I was wondering in which ways art could make this field more accessible and approachable and bring it closer to a lived experience. So I explored what art has been done on the electromagnetic spectrum already. And one old example I read about is this one. So in the night before Halloween in 1938, Orson Welles performed the War of the Worlds on the radio, converting this sci-fi novel into fake news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey. And apparently some listeners took this for real and called anxiously police, newspaper offices and radio stations. And it also convinced many journalists, and that the show had caused a nationwide hysteria. So that is one of the early broadly resected pieces of radio art. Yet I was searching for radio art beyond broadcast radio, so kind of more timely reflection of radio, because today radio is so much more than broadcast radio, so just radio stations. It is also machine-to-machine communication. It is a lot of digital communication. I wanted something that shows the vastness of the electromagnetic spectrum. And here I put a quite lengthy quote I read to you from Heather Content, an Australian media art historian, because I think she quite aptly covers a lot of things in radio which I'm also interested in. The broad application of radio, basically the natural phenomena connected to radio, and also the central aspects of radio. The question if and how radio connects to the human experience. So imagine perceiving every radio signal floating around you. You could tune in into news and hit tunes on AM and FM station, as well as transmissions at frequencies beyond the dial, like the unintelligible digital data streams emitted by cellular devices, Wi-Fi routers, and other wireless technologies. You could even hear strange bursts from outer space and audible traces of lightning from the ionosphere. This might remind you that radio is a natural phenomenon, a form of electromagnetic energy left over from the beginning of the universe that humans have only relatively recently learned to interact with for telecommunications purposes. Soon you might begin to wonder about the potential of these omnipresent radio waves. Could they do more than simply transmit information? Could humanity's interactions with them change? Could they change humanity's interactions? So this was from an article by Heather Content on the Macro Lab. So the article was called Macro Lab as an apparatus for global observation. And I don't know if you heard about Macro Lab, but it was basically a mobile art installation that traveled the world from 1997 to 2007, giving individuals like yourself the opportunity to experience the planet's vast oceans of radio waves. So Microlab was a moving radio laboratory housing radio equipment to receive and transmit all kinds of radio signal. It allowed the visitors to listen in shortwave radio stations, mobile phones, navigation systems, television broadcasts, and communication satellites. The project was created by the Slovenian radio enthusiast and theatrical director Toma Pilein. He was visiting the Croatian islands of Krk during the Yugoslav wars in a place that was called the Moon for its desolate rocky landscape. So that's what you can see here. And hearing the sounds of artillery in the distance, he felt the need to create some kind of pacifist autonomy within a society at war. So the idea came up to create a mobile radio observation station to listen, a counterpiece to the noise of conflict. And the project very much rested on the work of the Russian poet Velimir Klevnikov. And Klevnikov wrote an evocative piece on the utopian potential of radio called The Future of Radio. And he writes, the radio of the future, the central tree of our consciousness, will inaugurate new ways to cope with our endless undertakings and will unite all mankind. Radio is becoming the spiritual son of the country, a great wizard and sorcerer. Quite poetic, and I think the first one might have not come true. But yeah, it's definitely a very influential piece of technology. But let's take a step back and look what actually radio is. So radio describes the transmission and reception of electromagnetic waves. And what is an electromagnetic wave? A quick refresher from school times maybe. When we're talking about electromagnetic waves, we're talking about variations in intensity of the electromagnetic field moving through space. So that's basically it. And on a simplified level, we are mostly interested just in two aspects, and that is frequency and amplitude on a very simplified way of thinking about it. But in this context, that's all we need. I here created a little applications where we can see two forms of displaying kind of signals, radio signals. And one is kind of discrete, a kind of a continuous waveform. Basically, that's the raw radio signal. and then there's up there's a waterfall plot, and that's a very common way of displaying frequencies or signals. And here we say I increase the frequency, and this line goes up on the waterfall plot. So basically, you see the time axis is shifted by 90 degrees here, but it's basically the same signal. And that's a very common way of displaying any kind of radio signal. So on one hand, we have the time domain, and on this is called the frequency domain. And coming from this frequency domain description, there is also other ways of showing the spectrum, and a very widespread way is electromagnetic spectrum models. And they are an art form on its own, I would say. We'll now look through some. They often hold a lot of information, so they try to show all different sources of EM radiation, natural and human-made. And as this field is so broad and so vast, of course, they always kind of fail in incorporating everything. At least they try. This is a very nice one from NASA. And here you see visible light. And here, down here in the lower frequencies, we have radio waves. And up there are X-rays and gamma waves. And then we see some technical applications. There are also historic ones. This is one from 1944. It's quite overwhelming. We won't go into detail about this, but I think it's kind of beautiful. They all have kind of different kind of focus. So this one is focusing mostly on radio astronomy. So we have satellites and which parts of the spectrum they can perceive. There's also the transparency of the atmosphere to a certain part of the spectrum. So here you see it's very opaque. Then visible light comes very easily through the spectrum and through the atmosphere. And then in the longer waves also it goes down to our satellite dishes. So you see in this part of the spectrum, we are not so much interfered by basically stellar radio waves, because there are a lot of stellar radio waves out there. Then there are the ones which kind of break the rectangular approach and go for a more dynamic gesture. And then there are clip art PowerPoint slide versions of it. Also really like this one. Yeah, and then there are kind of weird ones where kind of the wavelength is described to the size of certain marine animals. I don't know exactly why you would compare those two. Yes, and there is also spectrum allocation charts, another class of spectrum diagrams. And basically what this does, it's a part of kind of legislation. So they show us the frequency band legislation in certain countries. So which part of the spectrum we can use for certain applications. So there, for example, marine communication or aerospace, but also military or civil use. We will notice that the military is actually a driving force for radio technology, sadly. So we'll always kind of have some kind of aspects that are influenced by military. But I think art is also a great place to counteract that. Yeah, and many countries have those colorful charts, and they use different color schemes. This is from South Africa. Then we have one from the Sultanate of Oman. And I think here it's quite interesting that a country that criminalizes homosexuality has a lot of rainbows in their legal documents. I really like this one. This is from Thailand, because it very visually puts like kind of graphics, what spectrum does what. So, for example, one spectrum is for TV, as you can see. So this is more understandable. So each country controls how its spectrum is allocated, but it really needs international kind of cooperation to do this effectively, because of course radio waves don't stop at borders, and also the radio spectrum is a limited resource. So we have certain frequency spectrum where we can use that, and there's nothing beyond that. So and it overlaps, of course. So if we have a certain application for a certain frequency, then we rather not put another application on top of it. For example, this device here also is inside those regulations. It is a very defined spectrum which you can use. And this spectrum is basically regulated by the International Communications Union. And the ITU is one of the first international organizations, actually. It was founded in 1865 already, and it's, besides the International Red Cross, really one of the oldest such organizations. And they're also responsible for the title of this talk because they define radio waves as following: electromagnetic waves of frequencies arbitrarily lower than 300 gigahertz, so that's 3 terahertz, propagated in space without artificial guide. And to give it a lower boundary, I also added 3 hertz. Amateur radio. I don't know if you've heard about amateur radio. Everyone has maybe their own thoughts about that or kind of images. But it's a part of radio culture which deserves its own talk, basically. And the ITU describes radio amateurs as persons who are interested in radio techniques solely with a personal aim and without pecuniary interest. And the ITU member states provide them with specific frequency bands to transmit on. And I think of those bands as kind of the recreational parks of the radio spectrum. It's basically a regulated public space which one can explore without any need for consumption. So it's kind of a playground. You can do not anything in very defined borders, but you can experiment there. And here is some law. So radio is always very strongly connected to law. So this is the Telekommunikationsgesetz, and roughly translated, it describes basically what radio amateurs can do on their bands. And you, as a radio amateur, you have to limit your transmissions to following use cases: for transmission experiments, for technical or operational message, or, and this is the interesting part, and I think here art comes into play in some form, comments of a personal nature or pictorial representation for which the use of telecommunication services cannot reasonably be required due to their irrelevance. So basically, you can only talk about irrelevant things on amateur radio. So my interpretation of this is art on amateur radio bands must be irrelevant by law. So yeah, so maybe not the best place for art, I'm not sure. So I was wondering what is actually my specific interest in radio, and I think at its core is the idea to unveil an imperceptible world. So it's such an ubiquitous technology, but we don't have the organs to perceive it, except for visible light. So this gap in perception makes it somewhat mysterious and unintuitive, and I kind of want to try to break that maybe, or find applications where we can see more about that, like learn more about technology in a more perceptible way. And this is a project of mine, because the only difference between radio waves and any other electromagnetic waves is, as we heard, an arbitrary boundary of 3 terahertz, as the ITU states. And we have organs to receive EM wave, which is light. And in this experiment I called Speaking Through the Light, I explored this fact. I transmitted and received audio signal through visible light using second-hand sound cards, controlling a flashlight basically. And I looked at light as a specific form of electromagnetic radiation and used radio technology to modulate and demodulate the streams of photons. And here we have a quick demonstration of that. So on the right side we see just a flashlight and a photodiode connected. And I was able to transmit kind of sound through light, and also did it at a larger distance here. So there are many artworks which make EM waves visible or audible, so we can perceive them. But there are also others. So Dunya Sahir, a biologist and artist, and their artist collaborator Christian Anutoy created an ear bone prosthesis acting as a tactile sensory extension for EM waves. So the gentle vibrations on the cyborg's ear would allow them to experience the wave on their most erogenous zone, on the zone which is the ear. And it basically converts EM waves to vibrations. So a very sensual way of kind of experiencing radio waves. Radio can also be part of a ritual. So this is a still from this post-apocalyptic series called Station 11. I don't know if you heard about it. Very recommendable series. And in this series, a group of kids sit together in the tower of an abandoned airport, and the radio is still working. And they use it to say farewell to the parents who deceased in a global pandemic. So they are well aware that no one is listening, but they use radio as a ritualistic tool. One could even call it kind of a radio funeral. So we covered a lot of signals created from humans, for humans, yet radio waves are also a central part of all of nature. So we will hear now sonified radio waves called whistlers. They are at the very low end of the spectrum, as light is on the very upper end. And they're happening around 1 kilohertz. So let's listen in. So these whistlers, we can directly translate them from radio waves to sound waves without shifting any frequency, because they are 1 kilohertz and we can hear 1 kilohertz. And they are created by a lightning impulse, and this is basically traveling around the field lines of the Earth, and are reflected back and forth from one hemisphere to the other. And that results in those repeating and rising sounds. So I want to conclude with a gloomy quote from Klebnikov's Radio of the Future, which illustrates our kind of modern day dependency on radio waves. So an excerpt, the least disruption of radio operations would produce a mental blackout over the entire country, a temporary loss of consciousness. And I think that might hold true in our modern day lives. Without radio waves, so much things wouldn't work. We are dependent on them on so many levels which we probably don't perceive. For example, just one of many, also weather forecasts are depending on radio, because we send out radio probes to probe kind of the atmosphere not on the vertical, but not on the horizontal, but on the vertical axis. And if those wouldn't work, we can also not do weather forecasts. So to open up the discussion, I want to pose maybe 3 very open questions. Maybe you have your own questions. But things I'm very interested in. So what might future radio enthusiasts be interested in? So like in the past, people were probably very much interested in just talking with other people from other countries through radio, which has some kind of magic to it. Today people have internet, so this is not so interesting anymore. So there are other ways of dealing with radio, maybe decoding digital signals or kind of understanding how Wi-Fi works. And another question is, how important is the aesthetic experience in exploring the radio spectrum? So here I'm thinking about not only kind of visual aesthetics, but also aesthetics in the sense of unguided or aimless endeavors, just for the sake of doing it, but also things like those radio spectrum charts, which are visually very interesting, but also antennas. I think antennas also hold kind of an aesthetic to it. So I really love to go through all kinds of antenna designs. They're like sculptures. And lastly, why would you learn about radio? Maybe what would you motivate you to learn more about radio? Yeah, that's it for my talk.
You want to start? I have a few questions. And I'll start. First of all, I mean, to what extent do you see how? I mean, I think it's very interesting that this whole sphere of radio and piracy and pirates. How do you say that in English? Piratensendern. It's been such an illegal thing. Like I remember, even when I was a kid, there were those pirates, Piratensender, which were like hiding around, they were running around from the government. So why is the radio element so illegal, and why is it still illegal? It seems so redundant. It seems so strange because, like, I mean, you can, but maybe is it because you can just turn off the internet if you want to? And the radio you can always keep on going, but who can receive it? So it seems so strange.
Yeah, I think there is a certain tension here. I get what you're saying. So I, for myself, I understand it because the radio spectrum is an infrastructure, and if you mess with infrastructure, the state interferes, of course. So radio regulations are important, I would say. So you can use the tools you want, but when it comes to radio, when you use maybe a frequency that is not in use because you can maybe not afford the license, then I think this is could be, I don't want to justify it, but yeah, there is a certain tension. I really see the value in regulations.
So basically you're disrupting something which is given.
Yes, exactly, yeah. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, if you're respectful on the spectrum, you know, you don't need to disrupt. If you use something that is not in use, maybe that's fine. I think there is a very strong political agenda here. So if you have a pirate radio, you might want to transmit like political messages which are not wanted or maybe suppressed. So here, like on a ethical level, I see some reason to do it, but.
Yeah, I see that like 20 years ago, or 10 years ago.
Yes, but yeah, today it's completely different. I think there's no there's no good reason to a pirate radio. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, I only see that what you just said about that actually it's basically you have a frequency where you're sending, and if someone disrupts that frequency, it's I mean, for instance, you disrupt the emergency calls. Because you're within the police frequencies, yeah, or you're within the fire brigades frequencies. I understand that, but it's just always seemed so strange to me. Like I never understood that aspect of it, yeah, because like nowadays it seems as if you can, but it still seems not easy. It still seems it's not chill.
I mean, it's easy to do it, but it's not chill. Yeah, you will be prosecuted for sure. Yeah, I mean, I could imagine it like if you translate it to audible sound. You know, if someone comes in and screams, they occupy the spectrum of sound waves. So that's not cool.
Yeah, but you still need a receiver for most of the spectrums. So like you can scream into the room, but like there's only a very, very small fraction of people hearing you.
Yeah, but that doesn't change. Like the worth of those people is not less. Therefore, like you're still screaming at them, you know, they can perceive it. They want to use that spectrum for something else, maybe, or I don't know.
Excellent settlement, yeah.
Do you know how much money the government makes with licenses, radio licenses?
Oh, that's a very good question. I really don't have an idea. I'm not such an expert in anything which I talked about, but especially not in licensing. I could imagine it could be quite a lot.
And do they make money at all with all the frequencies, or is there only certain frequencies that are licensed, for example, to telecom, and others are just governed and
yes,
are restricted?
there are just specific frequencies where you can earn money from licenses, and because there are other bands, for example, how's it called? The frequency bands for Wi-Fi. It's not a license. I mean, it's defined for a certain application, but you don't pay a license for using the Wi-Fi frequency band. Same with public mobile radio. So if you walkie-talkie, that's not monetarily licensed, but it's there's a law for, so you can just use it for this application. So it's bound to application.
But in general, it's true that if I put out a signal that's louder or that has a higher amplitude, it would just overload the other signal, and it would be stronger, and so I could like destroy or.
You mean you could destroy then the receiver devices? I think what I can say is that there are certain regulations on the transmitters, which is certain upper boundary of transmission strength. For example, in amateur radio, you have to get a certain personal license, amateur radio license, to be able to transmit at a certain wattage. So yeah, there is a boundary to it, also a legal boundary. And yeah, in terms of when you're loud, often it's not only about loudness, it's also kind of the bandwidth of the signal. So like bad transmitters, they have a bigger bandwidth than they need, and they might occupy more of the spectrum than they should. So there's also regulations how wide a certain signal can be.
Can you say something about the distance, how long each of these frequencies would be able to transmit? I mean, maybe in theory they could transmit the signal into infinity, but there is something like air or so that would also
make
the signal more noisy. The
signal
or whatever.
weakens over distance. Also, when there is no, because I mean, electromagnetic signals don't need a medium. For example, in sound, there's resistance of air, but for electromagnetic signals, they get weaker because they get wider. So, for example, you imagine a sphere and it expands. The surface area will increase, but the amount of energy you produced will not increase. So that means it's kind of dispersing. But an electromagnetic wave travels into infinity because the background radiation is also, the cosmic background radiation is also an electromagnetic signal, and we still can receive it even though it's from the beginning of the universe.
And when you talk about radio waves, which are electromagnetic waves, the common people, when they talk about radio, they only think about the radio, like music.
That's true,
radio.
yeah.
And
often
that kind of is not used anymore, or is used less and less, because everyone listens to digital radio or to streaming services. Is there? I mean, I think it's just not. It's a dying medium.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, it decreases. I totally understand people don't listen so much radio anymore because they have streaming services. But I see a big value in radio, and I hope you too. In like broadcast radio, again.
No, but I think also that I think the bandwidth, whatever is free, is going to be used. And so from my understanding is actually the bandwidth is actually a much bigger problem. Like when I was in college, they were having this big talks about who owns which bandwidth and who sells which bandwidth. I mean, it's been like 10, 15 years ago until that was the last time the digital cell phones and the G5 and all those things, 5G was gambling, and it was humongous sums of money being spent for being allowed to use certain bandwidths. So I think the last thing which is relevant is it's a scarce resource.
It is.
And I think as soon as somebody gives up only like a small fraction of it, other people are going to jump in and use it. It really blew my mind back in the days when I understood like how scarce this resource is, and how hard the battle is for it. I mean, not even talk about military right now.
Yeah, mostly big companies are interested in like making products that use certain bandwidths. Speaking of 5G, there was no spectrum left, so they just increased, and now I think it's 6 gigahertz because it allows for like wider signals, more data transmission, and so the only way is up, because in the lower spectrum everything is basically taken. So new technology often goes that way.
To a certain extent, from my point of view, it feels like real estate.
Yes, that's a good comparison, and that's why I also talked about amateur radio bands as parks, because this is a very nice thing that this was developed because it's a part of the spectrum that is not commercially used by definition, by law, worldwide, just to explore, just to, I don't know, experiment with wave propagation. You, of course, you're not allowed to discuss politics on amateur radio, but it's nevertheless a connecting medium, I would say, and I really like that.
I'm sorry, I have to ask you about that. How can you avoid people talking politics on their radios?
Yeah, through a regulation. Of course, they can still do it, but it will
So
be
the police going to
prosecuted.
move in if they talk about Alternative für Deutschland.
Oh, sorry.
So the police is going to move in if they talk about politics?
Basically, yes.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's in. I had it here somewhere in the slides. The law who says that you should only talk about irrelevant stuff.
It's very strange. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's a strange world, the radio spectrum. It is.
How many of these free frequency bands are there besides the amateur radio frequency bands?
When you say free, like free to use by anyone.
Yes.
I can't give you a number. I mean, there's certain, like, it's spread over the whole spectrum because amateur radio specifically, they want to explore all kinds of frequency bands because physically they behave differently. So for example, like in the 40-meter bands, you can transmit a signal and it will travel over the whole world by it will be reflected by the ionosphere, then it will bounce back to the Earth. The Earth will reflect it back, so it's basically like a waveguide. So these are very interested for amateur radios, but I can give you a number.
Is there any free to use bands in the higher regions, like in the gigahertz, or?
That's a good point, because there is something called the terahertz gap. It's a range of frequencies in the terahertz regime, and here we are missing the technology actually to make use of it, because it's kind of in between light and radio. There's this gap, and it has a term, terahertz gap, and basically currently science is trying to develop technology that can make use of this gap and also make technology in this field of radiation.
When I was studying in America, it was very interesting. It was something I'd never heard of in Europe. It's this whole like trucker radio stuff, which is more. I mean, I understand. I was understood that there are two forms of radio. One of them is very regional, where you have a frequency which doesn't reach very far. Another one is like where you can reach the entire world. And in America, it was a humongous thing. And I assume it still is a humongous thing. Yeah?
It is also in Europe, as far as I know.
It is. But I've never heard about it in Europe.
It's
So
LCB radio, as far as I know. And yeah, it's used by truckers also in Europe. I'm not sure how about it is today, if they use like maybe different technologies in the internet. But yeah, they have their own language, basically their own kind of weird jargon. So
it's totally a thing. It's total subculture.
Yeah, it's a subculture, another subculture. So radio also not only has space for a lot of frequency, but also space for a lot of subcultures and yeah, different kinds of things happening.
So we're slowly coming to an end. So maybe last question, Anthony. So Toma, then I would love to thank you for your outstanding talk, and good evening, good night.